Welcome to PRAJNA SPARKS special series, 59 Days of Healing, where we explore one maxim from the Tibetan Lojong text, 7 points for healing dualistic mind, each day to integrate the practice into our lives. Today is day 40, and we are working with point 7, tips. Maxim 40 reads, face all trials the same way. This 7th point on tips for the practice is the chunkiest one. It has the most maxims of the 7 points. And I like to call them tips because that's pretty much what they are. These are savvy points to keep in mind by our author, Kadampa Geshe, Chekawa, Yeshe, Dorje, who practiced these 7 points for a very long time. These are very informed tips, things that come along and that help us create an atmosphere of support that allows us to keep the commitments we make to ourselves and the healing promises and so forth. Of course, as we talked about yesterday, intention is a big deal throughout Buddha Dharma in general, and in the last point in particular. But we do see it in the tips as well. We saw it yesterday in that intention of being of benefit to others, to make everything sacred. Facing all trials the same way, today's maxim has a flavor of that. This also mirrors an earlier maxim. All of the Buddhist teachings have one guiding purpose, one main point. All of these are talking about two sides of the same thing. Unsurprisingly, it's the intention that is the common thread throughout the Lojong practice, the practice of healing dualistic mind, namely overcoming self-importance by moving towards a more expanded understanding of our existence, away from separate, single, isolated beings towards infinite, interpenetrating connection with all beings. To face all trials the same way, as this maxim is inviting us to do, we opt for connecting with the commonality of all beings in whatever particular trial we are facing. Maybe it's grief over the passing of a loved one, or the loss of a relationship, a job, any of the many, many trials that are a part of life and nevertheless can bring us a great deal of pain. Not all the trials have to be on the level of losing a loved one. It could be something as simple as just having a very tiring day at work. Whatever it is, this maxim is saying that by letting go of an already mistaken idea of ourselves as isolated without connection to anything else, we're able to face any trials with a greater sense of warmth and strength. Now, this doesn't mean that things won't still hurt. It doesn't mean that things will all of a sudden start feeling comfortable. What it means is that we will be aligned with our actual nature as interconnected beings. This brings forward a much more expansive view of life instead of a tunnel vision that the idea of a self provides, which makes us very often feel disheartened, even victimized. This much more panoramic perspective of ourselves, life, and the world in which we live allows us to tap into bottomless resources of mind. It gives us more access to the strength, warmth, self-compassion, and the like that help us face trials.
There's no question that some of these maxims highlight the importance of the commentary. They just have no discernible meaning without the commentary. I'm curious about that in itself. Why not put a little bit more of the content in the commentary? Anyway, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, do I have thoughts on that?
I knew you would.
This text comes from an ancient tradition in Tibet called the Kadampa, the sacred word lineage. The commentary that I learned and use, as well as additional commentaries that are in the resources, are from the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, which means the transmission or lineage of the word. In both of those Tibetan words, Kadampa and Kagyu, that first syllable ka is the sacred speech of the Buddha. Both of these traditions prize what's often called in the Kagyu context an ear-whispered transmission of the teachings. In other words, a one-on-one connection between teacher and student that ensures greater authenticity, less dilution of the teachings, and so forth. Very early on in some of the lineages, that's the only way that the teachings were transmitted. It's only later that they become much more widely available. I don't want to make it sound like it's just the Kagyu or the Kadampa lineages. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition as a whole is very much embedded in the context of very close connection between teacher and student. Most of the classical texts that we have access to with commentaries, the root verses are there for the teacher as kind of a memory jogging device. They've already received the teachings. They've already lived the teachings. The commentaries point out things like specific meanings of the words. It's very important to understand and maintain the intended meaning of the words and so forth. The commentary is where an individual lineage's take on the root text gets fleshed out. Normally, in a teaching setting in Tibetan Buddhism, the teacher will use the root text and the commentary together with their own experience to pass that on to a student. In many ways, the seeming telegraphic quality of the root text is in line with what is in the Tantra teachings are called the self-secret quality. People always think, ooh, it's self-secret. It must be so mysterious. It's not mysterious. It's just opaque. If you don't have a teacher, you will never be able to figure out what the heck this is talking about. And it's a way of preserving the authenticity of teachings without them getting diluted or distorted or cast in a light other than the original intention. And yes, that's my short version of that answer.
Wow, that's marvelous. I loved hearing more about that. And I'm so interested in that process of transmission of teachings. I don't know the Tibetan or the Sanskrit word for podcast, but we're doing our own sort of version of the ear whispering here. You know, I realized that we started this podcast because I said, oh, I want more people to hear you teach. The amazing thing that I am getting from this is I get a one-on-one teaching every episode we do. And it's been such a rich experience for me. I get the idea of that sort of ear whispering that you're doing with me and how beneficial it is. So I just have a lot of appreciation for that and for the ways that you elaborate on these absolutely opaque maxims that I just wouldn't understand at all without you.
Thank you so much. I do think podcasts bring a whole other meaning to ear whispered that we didn't have before. I also want to take a moment to remind folks that the teachings of the Buddha were not written down as he spoke. There weren't like court stenographers sitting around typing everything he said. It was an oral tradition. At the time, writing things down was considered less reliable. It wasn't something that was alive in the mind. There's a significant shift in our culture that happens when alphabets and writing become more common. We start to rely on a piece of paper because our memories are just not practiced to the extent they were before. And so now we prize words on the paper or historical timelines, all kinds of very dualistic ways of keeping records of what happens. I love this oral tradition. It's a tradition of beings who are containers, living, breathing containers of the Buddha's teachings. Never go wrong with a lineage of teachers who sustain those teachings accurately in their hearts.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. And now that we've talked about why we can't make sense of face all trials the same way by just saying that alone. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the content of it. I have a question. I think that this focusing on commonalities, focusing on other people who are having the same plight, I find that to be so useful to remember that I'm not the only one suffering this particular thing, that whatever it is that I'm experiencing, there are other people who have and are at this moment experiencing that same feeling or external experience. One of the questions that I have is, we have commonalities and yet we have distinct circumstances. And so I'm wondering, is this guiding us to focus on the commonality rather than the distinct circumstances, or in addition to the distinct circumstances?
Oh, that's a great question. It's really asking us to go deep and find the commonalities. So there's two issues with this situation. First of all, sometimes when someone is prompted to consider the commonality of their plight among all beings, it feels like you're trying to diminish their grief or their pain, or I've got enough on my plate, I can't think about everybody else. What this is talking about is going to the deepest level, which is also the most basic. We want our happiness to continue without interruption, without any fear that something's going to stop this, that suffering is going to come. And at the same time, we've never experienced that. Why do we still want it? In our lineage, this is considered evidence of the Buddha nature. It is Buddha nature that makes us want that experience of complete happiness, free of suffering, not even the slightest fear that it will end. That is the commonality that we share. That is our nature. We are suffering. Despite that, no greater cause for compassion for ourselves or others.
This has been Yeshe and Tanya on day 40 of PRAJNA SPARKS special series, 59 Days of Healing. Tune in daily for more maxims from the Tibetan Lojong text, 7 Points for Healing Dualistic Mind. Check the episode notes for more resources, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at PRAJNA SPARKS, and email us at sparks@prajnafire.com with any questions. May all beings benefit.